Well, hi everyone, Dave Cross again, back with a quick update on my PowerShell DNS Stats script. And also I wanted to go in a little bit more about some of the APIs that we're working with the IPControl and some of the capabilities that through PowerShell, which really makes this working with objects so easy, how we can do some things like exporting, importing. And I had a couple examples kind of walk through. But first, I wanted to go over my PowerShell script real quick because I noticed as I was running these scripts after doing the first video that I wasn't getting the serial number printout the way I expected. However, when I ran it as an individual line using just that current line run, that it was working fine. And I discovered that I needed to go back, or did go back, and put some formatting into it to allow PowerShell to properly handle the columns and the formatting of the data, because apparently it was conflicting with the first output, which I guess is a little difficult to explain. So just to run that script again, now by running this, pulling out the parameters, which I then put at the top of the script now, this query types and server counters, but then also pulling out the zones and properly displaying the serial number. So I just want to do a real quick update on that. And what I effectively found where that was breaking was I then piped it into the format table, which then properly formatted this. So anyone trying to follow that example, take a look at the format table if you're running into the same issue and kind of start there, and that would probably help out a good bit. Now, what I also wanted to follow up on, as I was discussing in my first video with the PowerShell DNS, is I had kind of built a wrapper of some of the IPControl APIs using PowerShell because of its capabilities and simplification of invoking web services, pulling back the JSON, and really natively working with that JSON as an object in its capabilities. And so what I had started with is really working through the IPControl version 9 and version 10 support for the APIs and RESTful APIs that used a IPControl token, the IPC login token, as I had mentioned, I think previously in some of these videos. And I also wanted to, as I was entering the token, set up some way through the script that if it were being interactively run, or if it were being run non-interactively through scripts, of a way that we could establish some type of password in a hashed table that somehow obfuscated it enough that we could do this safely and not have to pass the password on the command line. So I built up a couple of methods using some things I had found on the internet doing searches that allowed me to effectively do that. And so I'm just going to kind of walk through one or two of these examples and show you first what I had done with the IPC token and how we get that information, and how I use this kind of file to check for the user to see if it had its current user's encrypted file to pull out his password, so I didn't have to pass that on the command line. All right. So the first thing I want to check real quick, I want to empty this so that you'll see where we're getting the password prompts. And let's do .ipc. Okay. And so when I clear this and I go to try and let's say get IPC admin, when I go to do that the first time, it's going to ask me for the information I need to pass into the parameters, which in this case, I'm going to do the IPControl executive and the username. And let's use, let's just go ahead and use the default here. And then the login I want to look for is TAC login. Now, what happened here at this point is in my script, I'm telling my login to go out and check for a file to exist. So I'm testing a path for this file. And if it doesn't exist, I'm telling it to prompt me for a password box or input box that I can then establish the password, which then on enter is going to be encrypted into this file and then decrypted on the fly as we're reading it in, so that it's not requiring me to pass things on the command line. And so, like in the example here, getting back our login, we can then pull back the details about that information. And so if I were to pipe this or try to look at this information, it's just not readable. And we could pull the contents into a variable, and then it would just be a hash string, effectively. Right, so, in doing that then, if I were to run the command line again, we would then specify the same parameters on the input. I'll do the same. And it already knows that that file is established with an encrypted password that is authenticated with, that does allow authorization, and it's going to go ahead and use that. However, if that authorization failed for any reason, or that password changed, it would invalidate that token, basically, and it would have to reestablish that login. So you would have to go back through the prompt then and establish the password, encrypt it again. All right. So I just wanted to cover what that does. And so I had built in this module, basically first to get the IPC token, but more importantly, that in the command, in the way that I'm doing this, that I'm encrypting the values. And so there's a couple of options when you're creating the new text, that you can force it out as a certain type. So we're forcing the file to be created, and then we're telling it to read into a secure string, which we then convert from the secure string to an out file. And then as we read this information back in, we're converting it back to a secure string so that the PowerShell knows how to handle that. And a couple of notes on handling some of the SSL and certificates and invalidated or self-signed certificates. You'll have to override the PowerShell and or supply some type of certificate with the commands. I'm basically allowing you to here add a type, which enables us to effectively just return true every time we get a request for validation of certificates. So we're really overriding it, saying that insecure on that connection for certs, not validating. We just want to connect and trust the source that we're connecting to here. And then it further goes down through the different protocols enabled, and also establishing the service security and certificate policies. And we're telling it to trust all, and that's effectively overriding that check. So I just wanted you to see that because that's important. And then the way that our APIs are constructed is they are, again, only over SSL. So we use secure connections with the executive to the port, and then our login point, at least initially, is login. And then here you'll see again that I'm passing the secure string to BSTR or to a string that can be read into this command without storing it or trying to in a variable, and then using it immediately through the marshalling of it. So it's somewhat complex and enough that it's going to maybe make people think twice about it trying to decipher or decrypt it. So in terms of the next commands here, we're going to do the login, invoke our REST method URI, and then the methods. And then the method is for post, and then we're posting the login sequence. So this is then going to go out and pass as a form with URL encoded values, our username, password, where we obtain the token. And you'll see here that if I have an exception, meaning that if I type the password wrong or anything, that it goes out and removes that encrypted password file because it may be wrong. It may be the password was invalid or something else was typed wrong. So we want to make sure that's cleaned up. And then I am removing that variable from the login so that it doesn't linger along with the PowerShell variables that someone might come behind me if I leave my open window and say, what's your password? And we don't want that to be there, and we don't want login to be there or any functions. Okay, so the command I just ran, by the way, is the get IPC admin, just happens to be the first, and running through some parameters here. Not necessarily the one I wanted to show you there, but do the example to explain it. However, what I did want to explain, and because this is pretty powerful, really two different functions. The first is, building the PowerShell wrapper. We really want to think about ways of building workflows. And because the endpoints of the IPControl APIs are single API methods, they're single endpoints, we want to, say, establish a get of some type function or export of data, processing each of the results, piping those results into another command that might pull up utilization and other functions, and or where we're passing the ability to clone information. So we're exporting data from IPControl, modifying that structure so that we can effectively clone it because it has values that are of interest to us that we want to duplicate. So instead of having to reinvent the wheel, we clone that type of information. And then we have other types of functionality that allows you to quickly add a site where, when you think about IP address management and new facilities, you might have to go out and establish a container policies, block type policies, device policies, and allow allocation methods. You then are going to have to go in and set up your networks and or aggregation blocks, allocate your networks, and then allocate any kind of pre-allocated IP addresses, i.e. Routers, switches, servers, all the way down to your DHCP addresses, and then any kind of DNS records that, of course, go with those records. And all of that is effectively 5, 6, 7 different steps that there is functionality within IPControl that allows you to construct that as a site template so that when I want to go out and provision all of the different subnets that are going to be provisioned into a container, I can just say add a site, use this template, and it runs and provisions it for me. But then I can also chain things like adding a container, adding an aggregate block for that container, and or some other type templates with it. All right, so really what I want to demonstrate in this then is the command that we have here for adding an IP site. So I guess first of all, let me take 1 second, pause, I'm going to come right back, open up IPControl and explain what that looks like. Okay, everyone, I had to resize my window here so that I could bring this up in this video. So I've logged into my IPControl instance, and I've navigated to the tools and to the site allocation templates, and I have, just in this example, 2 different template types. I have a new region, which is really representing that I'm going to create, say, a new state or a new top-level facility where I want a container built, and then I want to have an aggregate block, which is going to be later broken into various subnets. And I have a branch office template, which is going to say a cookie cutter type environment where you have a new branch. You might have a data network, a voice network, your management interfaces, loopback, and so forth. And all of those constitute a site. And it might be a cookie cutter site where every site of a particular size of clients or devices always uses that template. So the premise is, again, you would build various templates to match the size of the site and the various subnets within those sites. So my first template, just for this example on the add site, is going to use this particular template, the branch office small. And I want within my new branch office, I'm going to have 3 different subnet types, allowing the same models we have that I just identified. And these identified types are what they call block types within IPControl. So in this template for the site model, it allows us to construct the various subnets and policies that are going to be enforced when I select the template to assign it. And effectively, I can go in and pick and choose the types of blocks or subnets, whether data in this case, and their sizes. And then I can also tell it whether I want this to be, say, best fit, random, or sparse allocated for v6. And then as we kind of move down into the various parameters, since this is a template, it allows us to use tokenized variables that are pulled out of the different screens, like start address string and block size of the new subnet it allows us to create or selects. And then we get into things like current status, wherein you can have that this is a subnet that's deployed, and in that deployed subnet are individual hosts, and that the hosts are managed individually in terms of IP assignments. I won't go into the others here, but that's some basic ideas. And it's here that we want to also look at things like IP allocation templates that we can also further provision so that a particular data type block will have a allocation template for IP addresses that will have the first IP as a static router, the 2nd through 10 are reserved, and 50 through the last 5 addresses in the scope or subnet are dynamic DHCP ranges. So there's various different policies and settings, including the DNS and DHCP servers, domains, and options that we can predefine within this template, and of course have done so. And then of course there are, well, not of course, but there are other subnets that also provide these same type settings, and I have used different values and have pre-configured those to help us construct out this site in a meaningful way that you might use. So the way that that works, and I'll just show you how it works within IPControl quickly, is that I can navigate into my various containers, wherein you might have it broken out geographically like I do. And within those sites, I might navigate again to my example and say add site. And in this add site, I would select a type, and I can perform other types of input, such as selecting the network service if it's different than the subnet. And I can also define user-defined fields if I wanted to manually create those as an administrator as I'm defining the site. I'm going to leave those empty. I just want to quickly do this to show you. And so what IPControl is effectively doing is following the block allocation policies to determine the next available based on the block type. And once that's defined, it's going to create those IP subnets, giving me a list here so that I know then, tier 10.0.1.15. And as I'm looking into those subnets, I can quick view addresses to see what was created, and these are the pre-created, and everything else is available, because I'm going to use this for APIs effectively. And others where you might have other scopes or ranges by types, those again might be listed as other types of subnets, and you would have different types of ranges, that reservation range, and then your dynamic scopes. So that's the premise of it, and that's how that works. But there's also a number of steps that might be applicable to this request. And this is where we want to kind of extend upon this site capability, in that we want to potentially use existing sites or containers as a template, meaning everything within Arizona in this case should follow a standard template for the site. And by doing so, I know then that I can go up and look at the containers and see user-definable fields and various other policies that I can copy to make things more fluent as I move forward. All right, so there's a couple things I'm going to do in this script, and that's what I effectively want to show you. So going back into my site script and using that premise, and this is what I wanted to show you the power of PowerShell, is I can go out and add an IPC site, and I'm just going to kind of follow the prompt so we can see what it's doing. I'm going to give it the IP address of my executive, and I'm going to tell it my login. So let's see if TAC login has any. Well, actually, I was using ISCN. Now let's do that. Now, the site template that I want to use in this particular example is the template that we were just looking at and through our description. And that name is branch office SM. And so we want to basically use that exact name. And therefore, in your automation process, this might be something you'll need to extract or determine ahead of time. So we're going to go ahead and hopefully be able to paste this in that line. All right. And then what we want to do then is also be able to specify that I want to clone a container. So the container that I want to clone is going to be back into this policy here. Now, I have created in every one of my regions, it's just kind of a templated process, a standard template that I use for all of the cloning. And so this one, AZ001, when I create site templates, it's auto-created again through API, and it is what I use as the default template moving forward. So I just simply know that, and I know that if I do it by region, that everything is consistent, and it always defaults to 0001. And the site that I want this to be created is, let's do PS video 0001 so that we can see what happens. Now I'm going to go out, and I've gone and called the API that we refer to as the site API. I passed it in those parameters, and it has gone out and effectively created a site within Arizona called PS video 001. It has also set, I think, in this example, some additional policies, using those on the API. You can set these also programmatically. And it created through that template my various subnets, and of course their pre-allocation policies, if any, in which we should see the color-coded usage. So all of that was done literally through just a single PowerShell command line, but it was chaining together multiple calls that enabled us to do that. So let's kind of take a step and break it down and see how that works. Okay, so we've got our function add dash IPC site that we're calling. And as like our other commandlet binding parameters, we're passing certain parameters that are going to identify. And I keep these consistent all throughout. But I'm just going to make a note here because I started with a bunch of scripts that ended up turning into a bunch of functions within a module, each one independent. I still need to break this down and consolidate my functions because they're all repetitive. And I can literally greatly simplify this, which I am. But for example here, I've created in each function separate bindings and functions that pull in the parameters using the same thing. So IP executive, your username, always the same. And then we pull out that encrypted file through the token login. And then our additional parameters, which are also required, are going to be the template name, the container that we're going to clone, and what the container name we want to define is, and its port if it's any different than the defaults. So we still work through our standard process, our certificate acceptance, because it's self-signed. And let's just go ahead and get down into the headers. So we get down to our headers for this new API call. And it's here that we want to construct, based on our call to the login to get the token, the authorization bearer into our header that's going to be passed into these API calls to pull out the container and run those APIs. So in this process, I'm going to go ahead and pull out then the template URL. And I have a specific API that goes out and pulls in a template by basically a container name using that template name. So as I passed in AZ-0001 as the template, that's my container name. And so I'm calling that container, passing it as a get URL parameter. And this is a container I want to clone, AZ-001. I then wrap this into a try because we can track errors. Also, we'll return a response if there is no container that doesn't match or the misconstructed or malconstructed packets. So we go ahead and get the container result. I'm also at this point, because we're going to use this got container and we're going to turn around and modify certain parameters and reuse it in its entirety to pass it back into the import container, we want to make sure we do a couple things first. And that first thing we want to do is we want to remove the ID of the container we just obtained. And the reason we want to do that is the ID, if it's passed back into the next import, instructs the API that this is a modification. And it will then try to update that ID, which is the existing container, which we don't want, with the new parameters and effectively overriding what our template container is currently. So we don't want that. We want to make sure, and you want to make sure you strip out that ID if you're getting information and then cloning it basically and importing it back. Make sure you strip that out. And then also I want to get the new container, and here I'm going to set the get container result object, what this is now, set the container name back to the new container, which we're going to call this. And then lastly, I'm going to convert this, because it's an object currently, a PowerShell object, I'm going to convert this to a JSON string, which is the format we use in that API method. Now I'm also using a bunch of here documents. This may or may not be the best way to do it, but I just decided it was because it's a template. And again, I'm going to simplify this even. But each of these import methods, as I mentioned in our previous videos, have a input type wrapper that has to go around the JSON to instruct it that it's an import. And so in this case, there's one equivalent, which is imp container. And so I just want to build this here document, adding my JSON, and this is a wrapper to make it complete. Now, I would separate this into a template and say if it's type container, go do this, block this, root block, IP. You can set those up through functions. And again, we're going to go back down into our import container, where we're then going to set the URL now to tell it what the new URL for the import is, which we're going to pass into a try method for the invoke rest method, then using the URI as that method, as post, and as body import. So we're going to pass in the body of that JSON, or JSON as the body, and all of this content type in the header should be the same. And what we expect, if there's any error, that we're going to catch for this, and the error returned is in a JSON format. So we are going to deconstruct this from JSON back into an object, and we want to look for the fault string object. And then because this is an error, we can't continue really. I'm going to break out. So if it breaks here, or if we get an error, I'm done. There's an error, we can't continue, figure out what that is. However, if we do, there might be other things here. So if the template doesn't exist or something, you might then again break. So I have another catch here for the outer function that we're trying in the template, which is a container get before we do the import. Right? So it's the container get, and then it's an import wrapped into a try of an inner try wrapped around an outer catch. Okay. And so here again, going into the site here document, here variable, for creating what the site template or site input JSON should look like. Now the site JSON is constructed of both the container, so I have the container name, and then I also want to use what the site template is. And this is the input to the site variable. Now just a key note that there are some individual JSON structures that we can supply in this call that would add user-defined fields per each of the different subnet types, and allows us through this JSON and automation to do that. Because it can differ in your environment and other environments, I left it out so that it's not easily portable through different examples. But just keep a note on that, and maybe I'll do a separate, real quick one on how that works to entertain that idea. But going further here, I'm just going again and building the URL again for the add site API. So again, we're calling our executive port. Also note here that if you're using the automation appliance or our cloud automation appliance, you would potentially use that as your executive IP and in its URL, and it would proxy to your executive. And that's the idea there. So now we're going to wrap another try around our import of the add site. And so again, we're going to post this. Again, the body is site JSON that we've constructed. And again, the headers and content. And if it's created, and meaning if there is a result, we're going to go ahead and tell it is successfully added. And if there's an error, we're going to go ahead and suggest what the error is and move on from there. All right, so that is in its entirety all that's required for calling the add site, effectively cloning a container, getting something that's out there as a template, pressing to a new container name or changing any of the parameters, setting any of the user-defined fields if you needed to, or any of the other parameters there, and then importing that and cloning it within the same hierarchy of the IPControl tree. And within that same hierarchy, then you then have the same benefits of all the templates that work within the day-to-day business rules that kind of impact this process. But it established a couple of new key concepts here that we could then build in the container and block allocations and then the site allocation templates, which perform so many different tasks in a single thing that took less than 2-3 seconds to perform the function. So I'm going to leave this with you, in that if you are an IP address administrator and you engineer and have to set up sites and you have to plan this and go out and perform what the next subnet and things are, and it takes you more than a few minutes to get those details, you need to take a look at our tool, give me a call. Because even this alone, if you're only looking at it from an IP address management perspective and how we can work with the APIs and automate this, it's invaluable, and I think that it would benefit you to the point that you can move to bigger projects, whereas you're not dealing with the day-to-day address move and change. So that's one of the APIs there, the site. I think it's just an incredible thing that we're working with. Now, some of the other things I just want to really quickly touch on, because it's just such an so capable in terms of the way we deal with devices. And we have some exports, and I've created some exports where I can go out and do things like exporting child blocks, or what we'll call the subnets. So we can do this by individual block address, or we can do it by container. And I might try one here that's by container. So I'm going to do export IPC child blocks. Well, I'm not. Child blocks container. And let's just go ahead and just see what it prompts us to do here. Let's give it our name. And of course, it'll ask us for the container, and I think that'll be the last parameter there. So we could do our same container name that we just passed in if we want to get that that data. And let's just go ahead and do that. And so we have here, paste that information. And now, as you see, we have an export. And really what we've done in this API call is we've just called a simple invoke or init export child block function that passed it the search parameter or the query parameter, which in this case was a container. And it gave me an array of all of the subnets that matched. And I could go in and further qualify that to, restrict it down to other data, which of course we have other ways to do as well. Now that export here, probably isn't too useful for us. However, but if you're using the PowerShell, and I can go back in then and do this, and go ahead and pass this again. I could put this all on a single command and not be prompted, but we're here. Let's see if I still have it in my clipboard. And so now I've established using the variable construct, now this is all stored into the blocks, and I can further go down and start doing things like parse out the child block structure within each of those blocks. And through PowerShell, it just knows to enumerate this. And so it passes all of these values of the child block JSON structure and enumerates it so I can quickly see what they are and use those. And then further, if you're into that and you want to go in and do some searches, you could even tell it to select strings or variables or pull back just certain data from that extracted set. And then also you're going to have the ability that through that there's a subnet policy parameter that goes into the policies of the subnet where we store the DNS server and a list of those into an array, as well as the reverse domains and the forward domains. So there's a number of details that you can extract through this. And then you can also, if we're thinking about it, importing this, go out to do the gets, modify your data, and then just turn around and do an import as a function. So that's another, capability that we have. And then we can, again, do various things with exporting of different data, such as like exporting, subnets by UDF, as an example, because we saw that in one of these examples, there were some UDF strings, and it looks to me like there's a VLAN ID. So if we're, taking advantage of the user-defined fields in IPControl, highly recommended, and as we've discussed with these, and we can go in and search this data, I can quickly then, as that administrator, say export IPC subnets by UDF. And when I do that, I can then tell it that within the UDF name, I want to use VLAN ID, and the value is 1111. I have null there because I spelt that wrong. So let's go ahead and do this and just do that all in one command line to simplify it. And I'm going to use VLAN ID this time, and we're going to do 1111. Okay. Now, as you'll see here then, this particular search went out into IPControl and it looked up the user-defined field for VLAN ID, which is the equivalent of looking for the subnet blocks by its user-defined field within the user-defined field of VLAN ID and specifying that it contains 111 or equals, right? So this would be a very similar search, and by invoking the init export child block with additional parameters, we were able to do that. All right, so let's break this down again real quick and show you how that worked, because it does lend into some of the UDF capabilities. And then I think we'll call it a wrap there since we've gone on about half an hour. All right, so let me set this up real quick. Be right back. Okay, and I found that function, and we'll just walk through this kind of quickly, and then we'll call it a day here, or a video, maybe not the day. So the export IPC subnets by UDF, again, I'm going to use the same headers and the same parameter input capabilities, different parameters. And again, all we're doing here is taking the additionals past our base with the UDF field, the value, and a port. Okay, same type of SSL check that we've done previously. So I'm going to kind of skip over this, but what I want to get down to is kind of the format of how the query string works when dealing with user-definable fields and those search and lookup values. So the way that the UDF fields are constructed, when I look at the UDF field here, is it's constructed as a string, meaning it's UDF field which is the input parameter that we're looking for, dot the field name tag equals the data that we're looking to find. So again, when we build this query then, and I tell it to pass this as a filter, which I'm going to do as a query into this next string, that the string is going to read in the init export subnets UDF dot VLAN ID equals UDF value, which is 1111 in this case. Okay. So again, I'm going to build then this here variable that's going to build my JSON, which really in this case is the input that we need to do the search and to pass this into the init. So let me actually pull up the Swagger real quick that shows what that structure looks like. It might be easier to follow with those variables. Okay, so I've brought up my Swagger interface and I've put in the syntax of exactly what we're doing in that search. And so you'll see here, as I was defining, the query itself that is then passed into this init export child blocks is going to represent the UDF, which tells it that we're going to do a UDF filter or query with a dot. And from here, it is the construct of the field name tag equals the value. And the page size here, you have options that if you have a lot of these different fields, then working through interactive sessions and so forth, you can do pagination of these results and effectively calling this, certain calls again, passing it the next position and so forth, ways of working with it through the first position results. And you can also tell this that if there are free blocks within, say, a container or site, to introduce those as well. Now, I don't particularly want to do that, so I'm going to do false here. And the key to using the new REST APIs to simplify this in a single command versus in our normal SOAP and XML to begin the export, init export, and so forth. There's like 4 or 5 calls. The new REST APIs allow us to pass the filter or query and also tell it that by having the first results position attribute or parameter in the JSON instructs us to do all of the calls in one command and return just the results to us, which is a great savings of time and allows us to do more server-side performance versus client, where all these are being passed back. So this has turned out to be great. And really what we should see then, of course, you'll see your curl as we've done through our previous scripting examples. You can copy and paste this to build your own APIs. And here's also the command that the URL endpoint for the API. But the point being is that you're going to then get this structure that's being returned back to you in that case. Right? So that's what we're looking at in terms of the blocks. And you'll see here then that our user-defined fields, and this is the structure of these fields that we could then further process from there. Okay, so that's the structure of how we're doing it. And nextly, we're going to go ahead and set the URL up again. Again, I would simplify that and then pass it into a try, our child blocks, to go ahead and invoke that export, again, passing the query as the body in its JSON format and structure, checking the results, and we're just piping it out. I'm not doing any further processing, and that's where you would go in and do some additional processing by additional pipelines or other capabilities, and also where I want to go to with building additional pipelines. And that's kind of where I started to go with this and looking at the invokes, in that I wanted to create the ability to set up. Sorry, I had something got pasted there. I want to make sure I left that out. But I wanted the ability that, like for devices, that I could go out and perform either a get IP or some type of export past each individual IP address or individual, and be able to modify any of the parameters that are being returned back from that device as a modify. So using the pipeline to say, I've gone and gotten this IP address, I now want to pass it through a pipeline that I'm telling it specifically what parameters to change, programmatically, and it updates it in the database using then the import with the override and modification parameters. So I want to set that up real quick and show you how that works, and we're going to be done there. Okay, so for this real quick test in this pipeline, I'll show you, I'm setting up an address in IPControl 111 in my subnet that I can test with, and I'm setting up a couple of descriptive fields, OS, we've got the host name, domain, static, and server type. I'm just going to go ahead and create that so we can go ahead and get that through the pipeline. And I'm going to go ahead again and pass my executive and have it prompt me for this command so I can see what it is we're looking at. And the address. All right. And so now I've got IP, which is my IP address. And this is what I effectively want to pass into the invoke device function, which will then be a pipeline to modify it. So let's give this a try real quick. Hang on just one second. Okay, so I'll hope that this will work right, and we'll just kind of walk through it because some of these prompts are, I think, interesting to see. So what I'm doing here, and what I'm, again, trying to simulate with the pipeline, is that I have an IP device I've gotten, and I want to modify it. I want to modify certain parameters based on its object name or something. So I'm going to call this invoke IPC method, which then I'm going to tell it what actions I want, and I've passed these into my script as action types. And effectively, I have, either delete, done, or modify. Really new, which would be a new device, mimicking or cloning that, but I'm going to do a modify. And then from here, I can do other things, such as the fields. Now, there are additional fields that, again, I can go down into and pass as pipeline variables that tell us what we're going to modify in terms of the name and other things. So I want to tell it here that I'm going to do host name, okay, I'm sorry about that abrupt pause there. I didn't realize it's been so long I've run this, what the command sequence was, so I had to kind of go out there and type it out in order to see what happened there. But while I was running that, I realized what I needed to do. So let me kind of show you what I just kind of walked through here to show you what the values were. So I started off by going out and actually typing in the command each of the different parameters using the input parameters so I could see what the prompts were. So, I'm going to kind of back out of this and show you here what those were. So again, going back to the action modify, that's what I want to do with this record. I'm going to pass it in ultimately into this pipeline. I want to modify it. And it is quite literally from this action forward that we're going to tell it any of the different values that we want to modify by changing the input. And we can do multiple variables here as well. So the first thing we might want to do is I might want to go in and say now that the host name is now going to be Dave's video. And then I want to do description, and we'll do test video API. And I'll just leave it with that. We'll call that simple. And I'm going to go back then and I'm going to pipe in my variable into this invoke, and then it should get that information and then update it. All right, so it had an error here, so let's see what we've got there. So it looks like it had something from the status. Well, let's try one video here. Let's try this. Oh, all right, one more second. Okay, another interruption there. All right, so I figured out what I had done here again. What I had done is I had tested it out to make sure I was doing it right. And I had gone out and gotten an IP address, but I'd already modified it, and then that invalidated that existing IP because it's no longer valid. So we need to get it again. So I'm going to go ahead and get that address again, and we're going to take a look at it one more time. So we're going to get IP address, and we've got things like host name, which we have SRV. We've got description, which is going to say this is a new description, and something else. So we can do those two right there, and let's try to pass that in again to this pipeline and see if we can modify that again. Okay, so I've got this new IP that I'm going to pass it in to my function, my username. We're going to tell it to modify, and I'm going to tell it host name, and we'll just say Dave's PC, and run it again. All right. So the first thing to note that when I ran this invoke, and again through the pipeline, is I passed everything in, And in this pipeline, it allows for effectively all of the attributes, or the ones I'm interested in, from the input JSON, which it shows us here then this is what was being passed. And so when I ran the input in and I passed in the values that I wanted to modify, I would then go in and modify this structure, this being pulled back, modify this with the new parameters, and then of course import it back into the device, which it then, as part of the import modification, shows us the resulting IP address that was effectively modified. And we can then see that this was modified, its host name, its IP, and that those things were taken care of. So that was just a real quick example. I just wanted to show you and show you that it's capable to do this through pipelining. And I'm still learning that, so I'm working through it, but that's where I'm going. So stay tuned if PowerShell is of interest to you. And I'm going to continue to build up on these, but just kind of a long update to my past video. Take care, everybody. Have a great day, and we'll see you here in the next day or so.